Duke Eberhard of Franconia was standing in front of the walls of Eresburg Castle when he said, quote, "There is no bigger fear to me than that the Saxons will not show up in front of the walls where I can fight them." End quote. He basically called them cowards. The Saxons promptly charged out of the castle, and the Franconians suffered losses severe enough, quote, "that the bards asked which hell can accommodate so many dead men." End quote. In the Middle Ages, two armies encountering each other didn't always lead to them actually fighting a battle. In many cases, a demonstration of strength was sufficient so that the armies didn't have to engage, or a peaceful diplomatic solution was found. But more often than not, armies faced each other on the battlefield with clear intent. Yet, although the cause for conflict was clear, and it was certain that battle would take place, it did not just naturally begin. The immediate reason to start fighting had to be actively offered by one of the parties. This involved, let's say, rather vulgar means. In this video, we will explore how modern historiography explains the three most common ways to start a fight in the Middle Ages. The first option was to mock or insult the enemy's honor. Throughout the Middle Ages, chroniclers frequently report insults to a person's honor as reasons for fights, from single combat to battles and sieges. One very famous example for such a provocation happened during the Viking siege of Paris in 887. The chronicler Regino of Prüm informs us that the Norsemen were besieging the city while a relief army under the command of Henry, Margrave of the Franks, was closing in. The besiegers dug pits around their camp, and when Henry had approached close enough, they jumped out and, quote, "challenged the man, Henry, by throwing javelins and shouting at him. He, not willing to endure this unworthy treatment, fell upon them, and soon the horse he was sitting on got into the pits and fell down with him. The enemies came running and stabbed him before he could get up." End quote. While some of the sources reporting this incident criticize Henry for rushing in, they all agree that he had no other choice than to react to the insult in some way. He could not tolerate this blow to his honor and would have risked damaging his reputation badly. It seems to have been better to die trying to protect one's honor than to lose it. Offenses against a person's honor apparently justified a violent response and were an accepted reason to start a fight. However, one had to be careful whom to insult. If a person of lower standing insulted someone of higher social rank, the result was most likely a brutal form of retaliation, such as physical mutilation. During the siege of Alençon in 1051, for example, William the Conqueror was being insulted by the common inhabitants of the town he was besieging. The inhabitants shouted at him and drummed on skins and furs, thereby referring to the parents of William's mother, who were said to have been tenors. After his victory, the insulted William took revenge horrendously by cutting off the hands and feet of the man who had insulted him. This example is drawn from a chronicle called Gesta Normanorum Ducum, or Deeds of the Great Norse Leaders, written by the monk William of Jumièges. Let's pause quickly and consider our sources. All the sources cited here are taken from chronicles. The authors of these works were clearly biased. When chroniclers write of insults and mockery, there's always an intention behind it. In most cases, the chroniclers' reports follow a broad scheme. Their sympathy is on the side of the insulted, who are then innocently forced to fight in order to defend their honor. This legitimizes their cause and justifies their use of violence, while at the same time also belittling the enemy. Additionally, according to the chroniclers, those who are insulted tend to win. Chroniclers wrote on behalf of someone and pursued a specific goal, such as increasing the honor of their client. So these texts were often made on demand of nobles. In addition, chroniclers tended to write quite some time after the events they describe, or could not or did not always draw from reliable sources. Moreover, their reports usually followed certain literary traditions and narrative patterns. which explains the similarity between many of them. Because of all of that, the picture of the real event is always somewhat distorted. The events as they really happened can barely be reliably reconstructed. However, there are two reasons why these chronicles are good sources how a fight was started in the Middle Ages. According to Malte Prietzel, an expert on medieval warfare, these chroniclers are only unreliable regarding single events, but usually depict the start of fights in a repeating pattern. This pattern, although merely literary in its nature, is highly unlikely to have been a mere invention. Chroniclers are interested in distorting the truth just enough to portray their clients in a favorable light, but overall their stories still had to be plausible, so they could invent events, but not completely unrealistic ways of how fights were started. People would have considered their texts complete nonsense. In addition, the reports of chroniclers perfectly match our understanding of knightly honor of the time, so we know that they resemble social reality and cultural values of the time correctly. In Prietzel's opinion, mockery had three effects. Firstly, to demonstrate one's own power and to bolster up. Secondly, to intimidate the enemy, and thirdly, to amplify the enemy's will to enter combat. Additionally, these very recent offenses refreshed a remote actual reason for conflict. Suddenly, the men were no longer about to fight for a political cause which didn't interest many of them. They now sought retaliation for a much more acute and easily understandable offense against their honor. However, an insult didn't automatically result in physical violence. Honor could also be restored by retaliating an insult verbally or with gestures, or by rebutting the insult. Some of you asked us in the comments how we animate our videos. We would like to share our skills, but time is short. However, there just exists the perfect online learning community for such endeavors, Skillshare. So thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a useful community for all kinds of creative people who want to broaden and deepen their skills. From classes on storytelling to classes on character animation, you'll find pretty much everything creative on the platform. If you want to get into animation and video editing, I can assure you things can seem a bit overwhelming at first. One Skillshare class that provides a very good entry point into animation is Simple Character Animation by Fraser Davidson. Adobe After Effects in general, and character animation in particular, were some of the hardest things to manage for me when I first got into animation. Courses like Davidson's walk you through all of it and make things much easier. You can follow along his instructions, and in the end you will have your own moving character. As a bonus, Skillshare specifically curates their content for learning, meaning the content is ad-free and constantly updated, so you'll always find new classes to dig into. The first 1,000 of our subscribers to click the link in the description will get a free trial of premium membership so you can explore your creativity. The second option to start a fight is bragging, jactatio in Latin. Bragging meant to overstate one's own power and downplaying the enemy, which is also an implicit threat. In contrast to the direct insult, bragging was often used in an earlier stage, sometime before the enemies were facing each other in arms. One example is written down in the work of Bruno the Saxon, when Rudolf of Rheinfelden, the anti-king and leader of the Great Saxon Revolt, died in the year 1080 from injuries he had suffered during the earlier Battle of the Elster on October 13th. King Henry IV allegedly returned to his camp and bragged that he had now successfully subdued Saxony because of the anti-king's death. He announced that he would celebrate the imminent feast of Christmas in the most important town of Saxony, Goslar, at the heart of the royal property of the region. The threat inherent in this brag is unambiguous. But the Saxons weren't defeated just yet. According to the chronicler Bruno, the Saxons raised an army within 3 days, and Henry's hope to subdue them while they were leaderless was futile. He then offered peace to the Saxons, who declined because they didn't trust him. So what happens here is that Bruno emphasizes the bragging of the Saxons' enemy, Henry IV, in order to cast a shadow on the enemy king. On one hand, such reports of bragging and threatening serve as evidence of the enemy's ill intention, and consequently seek to legitimize the home team's own military preparation and in last consequence, the use of force. In our example, Bruno's account serves as an immediate justification for mobilizing the Saxon army. On the other hand, chroniclers usually contrast a bragging enemy with a subsequent defeat, which puts that defeat in an even worse and shameful light. In reality, Henry and the Saxons both deployed their armies, but in the end nothing significant happened. So the chronicler contrasted this non-event with Henry's announcement of invasion and subjugation, which made it look like a Saxon victory. The examples are numerous and very entertaining. Here are two more hilarious brags. In 876, Charles the Bald undertook an expedition against his brother Louis the German. According to the Annales Fuldenses, an East Frankish chronicle, Charles announced that he was going to assemble an army so big that its horses would drink dry the river Rhine, and that his men could cross it without getting their feet wet. The chronicler then makes Charles look pretty stupid, because Charles fearfully begged for peace as soon as Louis had assembled his army. Another chronicler, Cosmas of Prague, reports an incident involving a rather creative use of language. The Bohemian Duke Prietzel I forced a Saxon army to turn back simply by threatening them verbally. When an emissary of the Saxons came to Bratislav's camp, he allegedly threatened to cut off his head and put it, if you follow the Latin literally, close to his buttocks. This might be the first recorded instance of the phrase to shove one's head up his arse. The Duke's inventiveness seems to have impressed the contemporaries. The third way of starting a fight in the Middle Ages was the seemingly fair challenge to a fight without any insult against the enemy. In 841 AD, the three sons of Louis the Pious quarreled over their heritage from their father. Louis the German and Charles the Bald waged war against their older brother Lothair. The two armies met near Auxerre in Burgundy. They took positions on both sides of a swamp, ready for battle. Then Charles the Bald and Louis the German sent a message to their brother. They proposed that before the fighting starts, both armies should fast. That was actually pretty common, but suspiciously, they also proposed one army should cross the wet terrain unhampered, so that they could fight fairly on the other side. Lothair let his brothers know that he was going to think about their seemingly fair proposal, but then broke camp and left. In hindsight, the offer was not as fair as the chronicler Nithard presented it. Lothair's army was outnumbered, and no matter which army would cross the swamp, it would be very vulnerable and exposed to an ambush, and for sure there was not much reason for trust in a war of brothers. So declining the offer was smart. Nithard, who sided with Charles the Bald, simply wanted to make Lothair look bad by presenting him as a coward. Indeed, he risked being seen as faint-hearted, while his enemies could present themselves as brave and battle-hungry warriors who were denied their fight by a cowardly, retreating enemy. Similar reports are numerous in the sources of the 9th to the 12th centuries. They all have a similar structure. It is usually the side the author sympathizes with which challenges the other. The situation is presented such that it is not advisable for either side to attack. Certainly not for the side that was challenged. What is special, however, is that the challenge is usually presented in direct speech by the commander of the army. But in almost all cases, these seemingly fair offers and challenges are declined. As in the example of the Brother War, the chronicler usually intends to present his side as the moral victor, in the absence of a real fight. Interestingly, direct challenges are much rarer in wars against pagan enemies. Probably because these require no further legitimation but the religious one. A seemingly fair challenge triggers the same set of values and beliefs as mocking and bragging. The medieval warriors' understanding of honor. Mockery and bragging are direct insults, while the mere challenge to a fight is a threat to honor only if it is declined. So the trick is to make an unfavorable offer in the disguise of a fair challenge. Declining a challenge compromises the personal honor as much as not reacting to an insult. But challenges were not exclusively delivered by word. Sometimes they were accompanied or replaced by a threatening gesture. A symbolic attack, such as a lance pushed through a city gate, was as much a challenge to a fight as the explicit words of a messenger. Also, acts of war could have similar effect as a provocative gesture or statement. The Latin word jacescere, to provoke, is the term medieval sources use for such acts. This involved sorties on armies near a besieged city, shooting arrows at the enemy before a fight, or simply taking battle order. However, not all challenges were addressed to the enemy as a whole. Sometimes a single person or a group was challenged. In 1333, during the Second War of Scottish Independence, as recorded by the chronicler Jean Froissart, the Scottish took an elevated position. Their enemies, the English, didn't want to attack uphill and thus challenged the Scots to choose a number of either 20, 30, 40, 100 or 200 fighters to fight an equal number of English combatants. The Scots, who were there to relieve the beleaguered town of Berwick, declined because they didn't want to risk the Scottish king's right to the city, which would have been the case if their combatants had lost the fight. However, there are some examples in which group fights actually took place, especially when political entanglements such as a truce or planned marriages wouldn't allow a proper battle. In some cases, army leaders even challenged their opponents to a duel. One particularly interesting case is the one of Philip the Good of Burgundy, who was quarreling over the counties of Holland, Sealand and Hainaut with the Duke of Gloucester. His expenses show that Philip was preparing for the duel. However, the fight never happened. But Philip, meanwhile, made it known that he would actually have been ready to defend his honor. According to Malte Prietzel, this was the usual outcome of such challenges. Tactical motifs and political reasons normally outweighed the sense of personal honor. In the later Middle Ages, battles were started in much the same way. Mocking, bragging, and challenging remained in good use. However, the way they were presented in chronicles and other sources changed. In contrast to the sources of the 9th to the 12th century, the reports became much more extensive. In addition, there is a new ideal of how a challenge should both be uttered and reported. Ideally, the challenger eloquently insulted the enemy without being rude or vulgar. The goal was to be articulate and witty. This was, for example, beautifully demonstrated by the Duke of Bedford and his foe, the Duke of Touraine, before the Battle of Verneuil in 1424. Instead of referring to his birth-giver, as might have been done in earlier times, Bedford simply challenged the enemy with the ironic words, quote, "Inform Touraine that I'm coming to drink with him. Tell him to hurry up." End quote. Touraine, in return, nicely called Bedford a coward, as he answered that he had already looked for Bedford earlier when he had campaigned in England, but he couldn't find him anywhere. So, if you ever want to get into a medieval fight, there are several ways of provoking your enemy. It all boils down to offending or threatening the enemy's honor. The underlying function of these provocations is to justify the use of violence and to cast a shadow on the other side's cause. In the 15th century, verbal provocations and challenges were becoming less common. The European nobility's value system, with honor right at its center, declined, and with it declined the effect of honor on politics and warfare. The honor of the nobles, including rulers and monarchs, were more and more subordinate to the demands of the early modern state, so it became less and less appealing to insult the honor of an individual. If you find our content valuable, please consider donating via Patreon. Researching, writing, and animating these videos takes a lot of time, and the videos don't always do well with a broader audience. So Patreon really is the best way to support our channel.